Hello, it's Eric Strong from Strong Medicine and Stanford University. Today I'm continuing my series on anemia with a discussion of the iron panel. After this video, you'll be able to list and describe the tests included in a traditional iron panel, to list the etiologies of iron deficiency anemia and anemia of chronic inflammation, and to compare the typical findings on the iron panel in those two diagnoses. The conventional iron panel consists of 4 to 5 blood tests. The serum iron level, which measures circulating iron, most of which is bound to transferrin, which itself is the primary extracellular protein responsible for transporting iron in the blood. Transferrin is produced by the liver and increases in states of iron deficiency. The total iron binding capacity, abbreviated TIBC, is an indirect measure of transferrin. Thus, transferrin and TIBC always trend in the same direction, and there is rarely a reason to comment on both of them. The transferrin saturation, sometimes colloquially referred to as the iron sat, is the percentage to which the circulating transferrin is saturated with iron. It's calculated simply as iron divided by TIBC converted to a percentage. And last is ferritin, which is primarily an intracellular protein responsible for storing iron. Ferritin is an acute phase reactant, meaning that it may become elevated in inflammation, as it does in anemia of chronic inflammation, but also in liver disease, particularly hemochromatosis. The primary role of the iron panel in working up anemia is to diagnose iron deficiency and anemia of chronic inflammation, also known as anemia of chronic disease, which are possibly the two most common causes of anemia among U.S. adults. Iron deficiency can be caused by chronic GI bleed, insufficient dietary intake, malabsorption syndromes, and menstrual blood loss. Etiologies of anemia of chronic inflammation are primarily malignancy, autoimmune disease, and chronic infections, although it's also associated with diabetes and heart failure. So how does the iron panel change in these two types of anemia? In iron deficiency, the iron will be low, and transferrin and TIBC will usually be high, but occasionally may be normal. That combination will make the transferrin saturation also low, and the ferritin will also be low. In anemia of chronic inflammation, iron is low, transferrin, TIBC, and the transferrin sat may be either low or normal, and ferritin will usually be elevated, but may also be normal. What happens if iron deficiency and chronic inflammation are coexisting? Like, for example, in a slow chronic GI bleed from colon cancer. This situation can be challenging to identify. There are a couple of different possible patterns, but the most common is everything is low, except for ferritin, which could be low, high, or normal. From the previous video in this series on diagnostic frameworks, you may remember that iron deficiency and some patients with anemia of chronic inflammation have a microcytic anemia, meaning the average size of the erythrocytes is smaller than normal. The other major type of anemia to cause a microcytic anemia is thalassemia. How might we distinguish a thalassemia based on the iron panel? The thalassemias are examples of iron overload syndromes, in which some affected patients end up with excessive amounts of iron in their body due to either frequent transfusions and/or increased intestinal iron absorption. So, on the iron panel, iron is either high or normal, which is not normally observed in other microcytic anemias. The remaining panel looks like this, and you might note that in general, the iron panel of thalassemia can range from totally normal to looking like the opposite of iron deficiency, with the specifics of the pattern depending on the specific type of thalassemia. A few other conditions in which the iron and transferrin saturation can be increased include hemochromatosis, bone marrow suppression, and an uncommon group of anemias called the sideroblastic anemias. One final test to discuss within the context of the iron panel, even though it's not included on a conventional iron panel and isn't routinely available everywhere, is the soluble transferrin receptor. This is formed from cleavage of the membrane transferrin receptor on erythroid precursor cells in the bone marrow, which then enters the systemic circulation. Measurement of the soluble transferrin receptor is occasionally done in complex cases in which the distinction between iron deficiency and anemia of chronic inflammation is not clear after the iron panel. Unlike ferritin, it is not impacted by the presence of inflammation. In iron deficiency, the soluble transferrin receptor will be increased, while in chronic inflammation, the soluble transferrin receptor will be normal. A number of references advocate for the calculation of a soluble transferrin receptor to ferritin index as having improved diagnostic value over the absolute level of the receptor in isolation. That concludes this video on the iron panel. The next video in this series on anemia will discuss hemolysis.